Men who had stared death in the face and somehow walked away when so many others hadn't. The two lost crews, 10 men total, whose names everyone knew, whose jokes everyone remembered, were represented by empty helmets placed at the edge of the circle, a silent acknowledgement of sacrifice that made speaking easier somehow. "What we did today," Harlow began, his voice still rough from shouting orders over the roar of engines and gunfire, "wasn't supposed to be possible according to every tactical manual and training doctrine. By every measure, by every calculation of armor thickness and gun penetration, we should have been wiped out in the first 15 minutes. But we held. We held for 3 hours against overwhelming odds, because every man did his job, because we trusted our training even when it seemed inadequate, because we refused to accept that defeat was inevitable just because the enemy had better equipment." He paused, looking at each man in turn, making eye contact, acknowledging their individual contributions. The cost was high. Devil Dog and War Horse are gone. 10 good men who won't be going home, who won't see their families again, who gave everything. We can't forget them, and we can't let their sacrifice be meaningless. What we learned here today, we share with every other tank crew in this division, in this army. Every tanker needs to know that Panthers can be beaten, that armor thickness isn't destiny, that skill and courage matter more than specifications." Foster spoke up, his voice tentative, articulating what they were all thinking. "Lieutenant, were we just lucky? I keep running through it in my head, thinking about every near miss, every round that should have hit but didn't, every decision that could have gone wrong. How much of this was skill, and how much was just blind luck?" Harlow considered this carefully, understanding the question's importance. Luck played a part. It always does in combat. No amount of training can eliminate chance, but luck favors preparation. We used our speed advantage, our superior maneuverability. We worked as a team, covering each other, coordinating fire. We exploited terrain and visibility conditions. That's not luck. That's training paying dividends. Yes, we were fortunate, but we also created opportunities for fortune to favor us. The debriefing lasted 2 hours, every engagement dissected and analyzed like a surgical procedure. They identified what worked, the initial ambush positioning that caught the Panthers cautious and uncertain, the use of terrain to break contact and force repositioning, the coordinated fire on the flanking Panthers that prevented encirclement. They acknowledged what didn't work, War Horse's exposure when it should have displaced sooner, the momentary panic and loss of fire discipline when Devil Dog exploded, the near disaster when Thunderbolt almost got caught in a crossfire between 2 Panthers. As dusk approached, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed obscene given the day's violence, the division's Protestant chaplain arrived to conduct services for the fallen. The surviving crews stood at attention in their filthy uniforms, hands clasped in front of them or holding their helmets, while the chaplain read from the Bible in a voice that carried across the quiet field. They buried what remained of the crews near the tree line that had sheltered them during the battle, marked by temporary wooden crosses that would later be replaced by proper marble headstones, with names and dates that reduced entire lives to a few carved words. Patterson stood before the graves as the sun set, wondering what he would write to their families when the time came. How do you explain that their sons and husbands died buying time for other units to prepare, that their sacrifice prevented a German breakthrough that could have cost hundreds more lives, that their deaths, however tragic and painful, had strategic meaning? The words felt inadequate before he even formed them, cheap comfort for an irreplaceable loss. That evening, back at the division's bivouac area, 10 miles behind the lines, where the sounds of war were distant and almost abstract, Patterson found himself unable to sleep, despite exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. He sat outside his tent, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from a supply sergeant, staring at the stars that looked the same as they had before the battle, indifferent to human violence. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth instead of smoke and death, but he couldn't shake the smell from his nostrils, couldn't stop seeing the flash of explosions when he closed his eyes. Can't sleep either. Hughes appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee that steamed in the night air. He handed one to Patterson and sat down on an ammunition crate that someone had left outside the tent. Keep seeing it. Devil Dog exploding, Warhorse burning. Wondering why we made it and they didn't. What cosmic... The tankers joked they were made to burn, named after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised lights first time, every time. Movement, Foster suddenly hissed, his voice tight with tension. 11 o'clock, through the fog. Patterson's heart kicked against his ribs like a frightened horse. He swung the periscope left, squinting through the optics, his pulse hammering in his ears. At first, he saw nothing but the shifting gray curtain, wisps of fog moving like living things in the pre-dawn air. Then, like ghosts materializing from another world, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Low, angular silhouettes, the distinctive sloped armor of Panther tanks, their profiles unmistakable even through the murk. 1, 2, 4, 7. Patterson kept counting, his mouth going dry, each number feeling like a nail in a coffin. 10, 15, 20. His mind tried to reject what his eyes were seeing because the numbers didn't make sense, because no sane commander would put 5 tanks against 20 of the enemy's best. Jesus Christ, someone breathed over the radio, the words barely audible, but carrying the weight of every man's thoughts. Radio discipline, Lieutenant Harlow snapped, but his voice carried an edge of tension that betrayed his own shock, the slight tremor revealing that even officers could feel fear. Patterson's mind raced through the calculations, running through every tactical principle he'd learned at Fort Knox, every lesson from the battles they'd survived. 20 Panthers against 5 Shermans. The math wasn't just bad, it was suicidal. Every instinct screamed to reverse, to fall back, to radio for support and let someone else handle this nightmare. But orders were orders, delivered in crisp military language that made it sound simple. Hold this position, observe enemy strength, delay their advance. They had to hold this position because intelligence needed to know the German strength, because the infantry 3 miles behind them needed time to dig in, because someone had to stand in the gap, even if standing meant dying. All units hold fire, Harlow ordered, his voice steadier now, falling back on training when fear threatened to overwhelm. Let them close, we need killing range. The Panthers advanced slowly, cautiously, their commanders likely as blind in the fog as the Americans, each vehicle moving with the deliberate care of predators in unfamiliar territory. They moved in a staggered formation, turrets swiveling left and right like the heads of hunting birds, searching for targets. The ground trembled with the weight of their advance, a physical sensation that traveled through the earth and into the Sherman's hull. 50 tons multiplied by 20 created a sound like distant thunder, a mechanical earthquake that made the Sherman crew's teeth rattle and their hearts pound. Inside Thunderbolt, Foster had his hand on the turret traverse wheel, tracking the lead Panther with mechanical precision born of hundreds of hours of training. Range, 800 yards, he murmured, his voice carrying the flat affect of a man focusing every fiber of his being on a single task. Still closing. Patterson felt sweat trickle down his spine, despite the morning chill that made his breath visible in the turret air. 800 yards was long range for the 76mm gun, especially against the Panther's thick frontal armor, where the shells would likely bounce off like pebbles thrown at a castle wall. They needed the Germans closer, needed to see the vulnerable side armor or the engine deck where a well-placed round could punch through and wreak havoc. But letting them close meant gambling that the fog would hold, that the Americans could fire first before being spotted, that luck would favor the desperate. 700 yards, 600 yards, each moment stretched like taffy, time becoming elastic as adrenaline flooded Patterson's system. The fog began to thin, torn apart by the rising sun and the movement of so many tons of steel churning the air. Patterson could now make out details that made the Panthers real rather than abstract threats. The spare track links welded to the glacis plate for extra protection, turning already formidable armor into something approaching invulnerability from the front. The long barrel of the 75mm gun, capable of killing them from distances they couldn't effectively return fire. The commander's cupola, where German officers scanned the terrain with binoculars. In the growing light, he could even see the German tankers' heads as they peered from their hatches. Young faces beneath helmets, men who probably felt as afraid as he did. Steady. Harlow's voice was barely a whisper now, as if speaking louder might give away their position. Steady. 500 yards, close enough to see the camouflage patterns painted on the Panther's armor, the tactical numbers stenciled in white. The lead Panther's turret began to swing in their direction, the movement slow but purposeful. Someone had spotted something, a glint of metal catching the weak dawn light, a shadow that didn't belong in the natural landscape, some sixth sense that warned of danger. Patterson saw the moment of recognition, saw the German commander's mouth open to shout a warning to his crew, saw the turret transverse speed up as the gunner acquired his target. "Fire!" Harlow screamed, the word cutting through the radio static like a knife. The world exploded into violence. Thunderbolt's 76mm gun roared, the muzzle blast creating a corona of flame that lit up the dawn like a miniature sun, temporarily blinding anyone looking in their direction. The recoil rocked the entire 30-ton tank backward on its suspension, and the sharp smell of cordite flooded the turret, acrid and choking. Patterson didn't wait to see if the round hit. Foster was already loading the next shell, his movements automatic, the brass casing clanging against the turret floor with a musical ring that would haunt his dreams for years to come. All 5 Shermans fired within 2 seconds of each other, the synchronized violence the result of months of training together. Across the field, tracers and armor-piercing rounds cut through the thinning fog like horizontal lightning, each shot trailing fire and hope. The lead Panther's turret began to swing in their direction, but the angle was wrong, the armor too thick. But to their right, Iron Fist had found its mark. Its round punched through the side armor of a Panther that had turned slightly to adjust its position, exposing the vulnerable flank that doctrine said to protect at all costs. The German tank didn't explode. That was Hollywood nonsense. The dramatic fireball that audiences expected but rarely happened in reality. Instead, white-hot metal fragments ricocheted inside the crew compartment at supersonic speeds, killing or maiming everyone within in a fraction of a second. The Panther rolled forward a few feet on momentum alone before grinding to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from its hatches as systems failed and fuel ignited. 1 down, 19 to go. The mathematics still looked impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Germans recovered with terrifying speed, their training and discipline kicking in despite the shock of sudden ambush. Panther turrets swiveled with hydraulic smoothness. Commanders shouted orders through their internal communications, gunners acquiring targets with the calm professionalism of men who had survived the Eastern Front. The first German round screamed past Thunderbolt with a sound like ripping canvas, missing by inches and plowing into the earth 50 yards behind them. The impact threw up a geyser of mud and stone that rained down on the Sherman's hull, and Patterson felt the concussion through the metal walls. "Move! Move! Move!" Patterson roared, abandoning the careful fire discipline of ambush for the desperate tactics of survival. Hughes slammed the Sherman into gear, and the tank lurched forward, engine screaming as it redlined, tracks throwing up mud and great rooster tails. The key to survival wasn't armor. They didn't have enough of that to matter. It was speed, maneuverability, and the ability to present a moving target that forced enemy gunners to lead their shots and account for deflection. The Sherman tanks scattered like startled birds, each crew following the doctrine drilled into them during training at Fort Knox and refined through combat experience. Never sit still. Never give the enemy a stationary target. Use terrain, use speed, use anything to stay alive long enough to get that killing shot on vulnerable armor. Warhorse wasn't fast enough, or perhaps its driver hesitated a fraction of a second too long. The Panther that had been tracking it fired, and the 75mm round covered the 500 yards in less than a second, crossing the distance before sound could warn of its coming. The shell struck Warhorse's right track assembly, not penetrating the hull, but shredding the track and road wheels in an explosion of metal fragments. The Sherman spun violently to the right from the asymmetric drive, throwing its crew against the interior walls hard enough to crack ribs and split scalps, and ground to a halt, immobilized and helpless, a sitting duck waiting for the kill shot. Warhorses hit. The radio call was panicked, the careful training forgotten in the moment of crisis. Tracks gone, we can't move. Bail out, Harlow ordered, understanding instantly that a stationary tank was a dead tank. Bail out now. The crew didn't need to be told twice. Hatches flew open and men scrambled out with the desperate speed of those fleeing a burning building, tumbling to the ground and running for the nearest depression in the earth, anywhere that offered cover from the storm of steel. They'd barely cleared 10 yards, legs pumping, lungs burning, when another Panther round struck Warhorse squarely in the turret. This time, the shell penetrated the armor, punching through the steel like paper and detonating inside. The ammunition stored in the tank's interior cooked off in a catastrophic explosion that lifted the 30-ton Sherman into the air before it crashed back down, burning like a torch, black smoke boiling into the morning sky. 4 Shermans left, 18 Panthers still advancing, their formation barely disrupted. Patterson forced himself to focus, pushing away the image of Warhorse burning, refusing to think about whether the crew had all made it out. Panic was death. Hesitation was death. The only thing that kept you alive was training, instinct, and a bit of luck. "Target, 2 o'clock, he shouted, spotting a Panther that had momentarily lost situational awareness. Range, 400 yards. Foster traversed the turret with practiced ease, the electric motors humming. Identified. Fire. The gun roared again, the confined space of the turret filling with smoke and noise. This time they had the angle, caught the Panther as it turned to engage Phantom, exposing its thinner side armor for just a moment. Thunderbolt's armor-piercing rounds struck just behind the driver's compartment, penetrating the armor and igniting the fuel tanks in a gush of orange flame. The German crew began bailing out immediately, professional enough to know when their vehicle was finished, uniforms smoking as they rolled in the grass to extinguish flames. 2 Panthers down, but the Americans were paying for every kill, the price measured in blood and burning metal. Devil Dog, attempting a flanking maneuver that doctrine said was the best counter to superior frontal armor, had moved too far into the open, leaving the relative safety of their initial position. 3 Panthers concentrated fire on it simultaneously, their commanders recognizing the threat and coordinating their response with practiced efficiency. The first round missed, throwing up a fountain of earth 20 feet short. The second struck a glancing blow that tore away the Sherman's front fender and left the driver screaming with a broken arm, blood streaming down his face from where his head had struck the periscope mount. The third round, fired by a gunner who had survived Kursk and knew exactly where to aim, found the ammunition storage beneath the turret. The explosion was instantaneous and total, a fireball that consumed the tank from the inside out. One moment Devil Dog existed as a 30-ton machine with 5 living men inside. The next, it was a ball of flame and flying debris, pieces of track and armor plates spinning through the air like shrapnel. There were no survivors, no dramatic escapes. 5 men gone in a heartbeat, their lives snuffed out before they could even process what was happening. leaving behind nothing but burning metal and memories. 3 Shermans, 16 Panthers. The mathematics of defeat stared them in the face. "Fall back to the tree line," Harlow ordered, his voice tight with stress, but still maintaining command authority. "We need cover." The remaining Shermans raced for a cluster of trees 200 yards to their rear, a thin belt of poplars that wouldn't stop a determined round, but would break up their silhouettes and make them harder to spot in the chaos. It wasn't much, spindly trees that war had already damaged, but it was something. Hughes pushed Thunderbolt's engine to its limit, the transmission whining in protest at the abuse, oil pressure gauges climbing into the red zone. German rounds followed them like hunting predators, churning up the earth in their wake, striking trees and sending splinters flying like shrapnel that pinged off the Sherman's hull. A round passed so close to Thunderbolt that Patterson felt the heat through the turret wall, the air itself seeming to burn from the shell's passage. Another clipped Phantom's rear deck, tearing away stowage bins and the spare jerry cans of fuel, which ignited in a brief flare of yellow flame before being extinguished by the tank's forward motion and the wind of its passage. They reached the trees and immediately began engaging again, commanders shouting coordinates, gunners searching for targets. From their new position, they had better angles on the Panthers' flanks and rear quarters as the German formation wheeled to pursue. These were the vulnerable spots doctrine emphasized, where the armor was thinner, where a well-placed round could punch through and wreak havoc on the internal systems, turning superior machines into coffins. Patterson's crew fell into a rhythm born of desperation and training, each man moving with automatic precision. Foster acquired targets with mechanical efficiency, calling out ranges and bearings. The loader, Private Eddie Walsh, moved like a machine despite exhaustion setting in, slamming shells into the breach the instant it opened, his hands moving faster than conscious thought. Hughes positioned the tank, reversing behind cover after each shot, presenting the smallest possible profile, playing a deadly game of peekaboo with enemies who wanted them dead. Iron Fist scored another kill, its round striking a Panther's ammunition rack through the thin armor protecting the hull side. The German tank didn't burn, it simply erupted, the catastrophic detonation of stored shells blowing the turret clean off and sending it tumbling through the air like a child's toy, landing 50 feet away with a ground-shaking impact. Phantom followed up seconds later, catching a Panther commander who had exposed himself too far out of his hatch, trying to spot targets in the trees. The explosive round from Phantom's 75mm high-explosive shell turned the cupola into a death trap of fragmentation, and the Panther ground to a confused halt as its leaderless crew panicked inside. But the Panthers were adapting too, their commanders showing the tactical flexibility that made German armor so dangerous. They recognized they were facing a smaller force exploiting terrain, and began to maneuver aggressively, attempting to envelop the American position. 4 Panthers broke off from the main group, circling wide to the north in a flanking maneuver that threatened to get behind the tree line and trap the Shermans against their own defensive position. "Harlow, you've got 4 breaking left," Patterson shouted into the radio, watching the movement through his periscope. "They're trying to flank." "I see them." Harlow's tank, Iron Fist, pivoted to meet the threat, its 76mm gun traversing to track the lead Panther. "Phantom, stay on the main group. Thunderbolt with me." The battle devolved into chaos, the careful tactical planning of the opening ambush giving way to desperate improvisation. There was no grand strategy now, no carefully coordinated fire plans. It was instinct and reaction, each crew fighting its own desperate duel against enemies that outgunned them, trying to survive 1 minute at a time. Patterson lost track of how many rounds Thunderbolt fired. 10, 15, 20. The turret was thick with smoke despite the extractor fan running at full speed, the air unbreathable, eyes streaming tears. Walsh's face was streaked with sweat and powder burns, his hands moving with mechanical precision despite exhaustion, muscle memory carrying him through when conscious thought began to fail. A Panther appeared through the smoke almost on top of them, so close Patterson could see the German gunner's face through the optics. A young man, maybe 20, eyes wide with the same fear Patterson felt. Both tanks fired simultaneously, rounds leaving their barrels within a fraction of a second of each other. Thunderbolt's round struck first by the narrowest margin, hitting the Panther's gun mantlet and jamming the German's gun in place, leaving it unable to depress or elevate. The Panther's return fire struck Thunderbolt's front glossus plate at an angle, and for one heart-stopping moment Patterson was certain they were dead. But the deflection was enough, the round screaming off into the sky in a shower of sparks. "Back! Back!" Patterson screamed, his voice cracking. Hughes threw the Sherman into reverse without hesitation, and they disappeared into the trees before the Panther could reload, leaving the disabled German tank for someone else to finish. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the protective fog that had given them their initial advantage. The battlefield was a hellscape of burning tanks, both German and American, their black smoke columns rising into the clear morning sky like funeral pyres. The smell of burning rubber, diesel, cordite, and something worse, burning flesh, hung heavy in the air, coating the back of the throat with every breath. Patterson risked a glance at his watch, surprised that it still worked, that time still passed in this hell. 3 hours. They'd been fighting for 3 hours, though it felt like days, like years, like an eternity, compressed into moments of terror. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his ears ringing from the constant gunfire despite the headset that was supposed to protect them. Every muscle in his body ached from being thrown around inside the turret like a rag doll. "Ammo check," he gasped, his throat raw from shouting and breathing smoke. 8 rounds. Walsh reported, his voice flat with exhaustion. "We're running low, Sarge." 8 rounds against 12 remaining Panthers. The Germans had pulled back slightly, regrouping after losing 8 of their number to the stubborn American defense, their formation reforming with professional discipline. Patterson could see them through the smoke, their commanders likely arguing about whether to press the attack or withdraw, weighing casualties against objectives. Then, from the south, a sound that made Patterson's heart leap with hope he'd thought was dead. The distinctive roar of American engines. Lots of them. The rumble of heavy machinery coming fast. He grabbed his binoculars with trembling hands and scanned the horizon, focusing past the smoke and destruction. There, emerging from behind a low ridge like cavalry in an old western, came reinforcements. A full company of Shermans, at least 15 tanks, accompanied by M10 tank destroyers with their powerful 90mm guns that could hurt even a Panther. The Germans saw them too, their tactical discipline showing in the speed of their response. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent as both sides processed this new development, the sudden shift in the balance of power. Then, as one, the remaining Panthers began to reverse, their commanders making the only sensible decision. They'd bloodied the Americans, destroyed 2 tanks and damaged others, but the odds had shifted dramatically, and continuing the engagement would be suicide. "They're withdrawing," Foster shouted, disbelief and relief mixing in his voice, the words coming out in a strangled laugh. Patterson watched through his periscope as the Panthers executed a fighting retreat, covering each other in coordinated bounds, moving with the practiced efficiency that marked them as professionals. Even in defeat, they were disciplined, dangerous, but they were leaving, backing away from the field they'd tried to take. The position was held, bought with blood and burning metal, but held nonetheless. Lieutenant Harlow's voice came over the radio, hoarse and exhausted, but carrying a note of triumph. "All units, hold position. Do not pursue. I repeat, do not pursue." No one argued with that order. The surviving crews sat in their tanks, hands trembling with adrenaline crash, minds trying to process what they'd just survived, what they'd accomplished against impossible odds. 3 Shermans against 20 Panthers. By all rights, by every tactical manual and after-action report, they should have been annihilated in the first 5 minutes. Instead, they'd held for 3 hours, destroyed at least 8 enemy tanks confirmed with another 2 or 3 damaged, and prevented a breakthrough that could have torn a hole in the American line. As the reinforcements rolled up, their crews fresh and unblooded compared to the exhausted survivors, Patterson finally allowed himself to breathe deeply, to feel the pain in his body, to acknowledge the terror he'd suppressed for 3 hours. He pushed open the turret hatch and climbed out, his legs nearly giving way as he dropped to the ground, muscles cramping from prolonged tension. Around him, the other survivors were doing the same, stumbling away from their tanks like drunks, gulping clean air that tasted impossibly sweet after the smoke and cordite, some vomiting from the stress and adrenaline crash that hit like a physical blow. The battlefield was a graveyard, silent except for the crackle of flames and the approach of reinforcements. Warhorse and Devil Dog were still burning, their blackened hulls testament to how close they'd all come to the same fate, to being nothing more than smoke and memory. German Panthers lay scattered across the field, some burning with oily black smoke, others simply silent and still, their crews dead or fled. Medics were already moving among the wreckage, looking for survivors, though there would be few. Tank combat left little middle ground between unharmed and dead. An officer from the relief company approached, a captain with clean uniform and uncertain expression as he surveyed the scene of devastation, his face showing shock at the scale of destruction. "How many tanks did you have?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine disbelief. "5, Patterson croaked, his throat raw from shouting and smoke inhalation. "Started with 5 this morning." The officer stared at him, then slowly turned to look at the burning Panthers dotting the landscape like funeral pyres, counting them silently. "You held this position with 5 tanks against, what, 20? 25 Panthers." 20 when they came out of the fog. Give or take a couple we might have miscounted. The officer shook his head slowly, as if denying what his eyes were showing him. That's not possible. Every report, every tactical analysis says Panthers are invincible in tank-to-tank combat, that Shermans can't compete. Patterson looked back at Thunderbolt, its armor scorched and dented by near misses, its paint blistered by the heat of passing shells, every surface telling a story of near death. Foster was sitting on the hull, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with either laughter or tears. Hughes was standing by the damaged track, running his fingers over a deep gouge where a German round had come within inches of penetrating, within inches of killing them all. Walsh was on his knees in the grass, throwing up everything in his stomach and then dry heaving when there was nothing left. "Tell that to the Germans," Patterson said quietly, gesturing at the destroyed Panthers. "Tell them their tanks are invincible." The silence after battle was worse than the chaos. Patterson sat on Thunderbolt's fender, a canteen of water in his trembling hands, watching medics move through the wreckage like ghosts tending to the dead. The adrenaline was draining from his system, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that made his bones feel like lead. Around him, the other survivors were experiencing the same crash. Foster had his head between his knees, breathing slowly through his nose like he'd been taught to prevent hyperventilation, while Hughes kept touching his face as if verifying he was still whole, still alive, still real. Captain Raymond Decker, commanding officer of the relief company, moved among the wreckage with the methodical efficiency of a man who had seen too many battlefields. He stopped at each destroyed tank, German and American alike, making notes in a small leather journal with pages already dog-eared from use. When he reached Patterson, he crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the exhausted sergeant in a gesture that spoke of respect rather than rank. "I need you to walk me through it," Decker said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command but also something like reverence. "Every detail you can remember. Positioning, timing, kill sequence, decision points. Everything." Patterson's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of reliving the past 3 hours made his stomach turn, made the bile rise in his throat. But he was a soldier, and this was his duty, perhaps more important than the fighting itself. He took a long drink from the canteen, letting the water wash the taste of cordite and vomit from his mouth, and began to talk. He described the fog in detail, how it had reduced visibility to nothing, how they'd heard the Panthers before seeing them. He explained the moment the German tanks emerged like mechanical demons from the mist, counting them off one by one until the numbers became absurd. He detailed Lieutenant Harlow's decision to hold fire until killing range, the almost unbearable discipline it took to wait while 20 enemy tanks bore down on their position, every instinct screaming to fire, to run, to do anything but sit still. He explained the tactics they'd employed, the constant movement after each shot, the use of terrain to break line of sight, the targeting of vulnerable side and rear armor because frontal shots were suicide against Panther armor thickness. Patterson listened without interrupting, his pencil moving across the pages in quick shorthand, occasionally pausing to sketch a diagram or mark a position. When Patterson finished, the captain sat back on his heels, studying the battlefield with new understanding, his eyes tracking from the tree line to the destroyed tanks to the positions where the Panthers had first appeared. "You targeted mobility first," he said. "It wasn't a question, but a recognition of tactical sophistication." "Yes, sir. Warhorse got hit in the tracks before the Germans could penetrate the hull. We knew we couldn't go toe-to-toe with their frontal armor, and that's suicide in a Sherman, so we focused on breaking their formation, forcing them to maneuver and expose their flanks, making them react to us instead of dictating the engagement. And the fog helped initially. At first, yes, sir, made them cautious, slowed their advance, but once it cleared, we were exposed, had to get to the tree line, break line of sight, and force them to reposition and search for us." Decker stood, offering his hand to help Patterson up, the gesture bridging the gap between officer and enlisted man. "You know what you did here, Sergeant? You proved that armor thickness isn't everything, that training, tactics, and raw courage can overcome superior equipment, that the Sherman, for all its faults, can win when crewed by men who know what they're doing." He paused, looking again at the destroyed Panthers scattered across the field like fallen giants. "Battalion Command is going to want to study this engagement in exhaustive detail. Every shot, every maneuver, every decision point. Because if 5 Shermans can hold off 20 Panthers and come out victorious, then everything we thought we knew about armored warfare just changed." Over the next several hours, the battlefield transformed into something resembling an outdoor classroom, a laboratory for studying the science of death. Officers arrived from division headquarters in a convoy of jeeps, accompanied by intelligence personnel with cameras and measuring tapes, clipboards, and technical manuals. They photographed every destroyed tank from multiple angles, measured the impact points of armor-piercing rounds with calipers, calculated firing positions and angles of attack with surveying equipment, treating the carnage as dated to be analyzed and cataloged. The German Panthers became subjects of intense scrutiny. Engineers swarmed over them like ants on a carcass, studying the armor composition and weld quality, examining the positioning of ammunition racks and fuel tanks, measuring the thickness of steel at various points on the hull. One officer discovered that several Panthers had run critically low on fuel. Their advanced Maybach engines consumed gasoline at an alarming rate, nearly twice what a Sherman used, and German supply lines were stretched thin across hundreds of miles of contested territory. Another noted that, while the Panthers' excellent frontal armor made it nearly invulnerable from the front, this advantage came at a significant cost. The sides and rear were comparatively vulnerable, and the tank's narrow tracks made it less maneuverable than the Sherman in muddy conditions, more prone to bogging down or throwing a track. "Look at this," a lieutenant called out from inside one of the disabled Panthers, his voice echoing in the metal chamber. Patterson walked over, curiosity overcoming exhaustion, and peered through the crew hatch. The interior was remarkably spacious compared to a Sherman, with ergonomic positioning of controls and excellent visibility for the gunner through sophisticated optics. The radio equipment looked state-of-the-art. The seats were padded, and there was actually room to move without bumping into your crewmates. But the lieutenant was pointing at something else. A thick manual, easily 300 pages, secured to the wall near the commander's position with metal clips. "Manitant's manual," the lieutenant explained, flipping through pages dense with technical diagrams and instructions. "The Panther's over-engineered. Excellent machine when it works perfectly, but it requires constant maintenance. Transmission failures, final drive problems, engine overheating, track tension issues. The Germans built a masterpiece of engineering, but it's too complicated for field conditions, too delicate for the brutal reality of combat operations. Patterson thought about Thunderbolt, with its relatively simple and reliable Ford GAA engine, its easily replaced parts that could be scavenged from other tanks, its design philosophy of good enough and reliable rather than perfect but fragile. The Sherman could be repaired in a muddy field with basic tools and determination. The Panther required specialized equipment, trained mechanics, and parts that had to be shipped from Germany. Excellence meant nothing if you couldn't keep the machine running. By afternoon, word of the engagement had spread throughout the division like wildfire, carried by radio operators and supply truck drivers, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling. Tank crews who had feared the Panther as an invincible monster, who had approached every engagement with fatalistic resignation, began to see it differently. Yes, it was dangerous. Nobody was denying that. Yes, it had superior armor and a more powerful gun. But it could be beaten. It had been beaten. The myth of invincibility was shattered, and that psychological shift was as important as any tactical lesson, perhaps more so. Lieutenant Harlow, his face still smudged with powder burns that soap and water hadn't quite removed, gathered the surviving crews for a debriefing in a field away from the wreckage. They sat in a semicircle on the damp grass, 11 men who had stared death in the face and somehow walked away when so many others hadn't. The 2 lost crews, 10 men total, whose names everyone knew, whose jokes everyone remembered, were represented by empty helmets placed at the edge of the circle, a silent acknowledgement of sacrifice that made speaking easier somehow. "What we did today," Harlow began, his voice still rough from shouting orders over the roar of engines and gunfire, "wasn't supposed to be possible according to every tactical manual and training doctrine. By every measure, by every calculation of armor thickness and gun penetration, we should have been wiped out in the first 15 minutes. But we held. We held for 3 hours against overwhelming odds, because every man did his job, because we trusted our training even when it seemed inadequate, because we refused to accept that defeat was inevitable just because the enemy had better equipment." He paused, looking at each man in turn, making eye contact, acknowledging their individual contributions. The cost was high. Devil Dog and War Horse are gone. 10 good men who won't be going home, who won't see their families again, who gave everything. We can't forget them, and we can't let their sacrifice be meaningless. What we learned here today, we share with every other tank crew in this division, in this army. Every tanker needs to know that Panthers can be beaten, that armor thickness isn't destiny, that skill and courage matter more than specifications. Foster spoke up, his voice tentative, articulating what they were all thinking. "Lieutenant, were we just lucky? I keep running through it in my head, thinking about every near miss, every round that should have hit but didn't, every decision that could have gone wrong. How much of this was skill, and how much was just blind luck?" Harlow considered this carefully, understanding the question's importance. Luck played a part. It always does in combat. No amount of training can eliminate chance, but luck favors preparation. We used our speed advantage, our superior maneuverability. We worked as a team, covering each other, coordinating fire. We exploited terrain and visibility conditions. That's not luck. That's training paying dividends. Yes, we were fortunate, but we also created opportunities for fortune to favor us. The debriefing lasted 2 hours, every engagement dissected and analyzed like a surgical procedure. They identified what worked, the initial ambush positioning that caught the Panthers cautious and uncertain, the use of terrain to break contact and force repositioning, the coordinated fire on the flanking Panthers that prevented encirclement. They acknowledged what didn't work: Warhorse's exposure when it should have displaced sooner, the momentary panic and loss of fire discipline when Devil Dog exploded, the near disaster when Thunderbolt almost got caught in a crossfire between two Panthers. As dusk approached, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed obscene given the day's violence, the division's Protestant chaplain arrived to conduct services for the fallen. The surviving crews stood at attention in their filthy uniforms, hands clasped in front of them or holding their helmets, while the chaplain read from the Bible in a voice that carried across the quiet field. They buried what remained of the crews near the tree line that had sheltered them during the battle, marked by temporary wooden crosses that would later be replaced by proper marble headstones, with names and dates that reduced entire lives to a few carved words. Patterson stood before the graves as the sun set, wondering what he would write to their families when the time came. How do you explain that their sons and husbands died buying time for other units to prepare, that their sacrifice prevented a German breakthrough that could have cost hundreds more lives, that their deaths, however tragic and painful, had strategic meaning? The words felt inadequate before he even formed them, cheap comfort for an irreplaceable loss. That evening, back at the division's bivouac area, 10 miles behind the lines, where the sounds of war were distant and almost abstract, Patterson found himself unable to sleep, despite exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. He sat outside his tent, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from a supply sergeant, staring at the stars that looked the same as they had before the battle, indifferent to human violence. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth instead of smoke and death, but he couldn't shake the smell from his nostrils, couldn't stop seeing the flash of explosions when he closed his eyes. Can't sleep either? Hughes appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee that steamed in the night air. He handed one to Patterson and sat down on an ammunition crate that someone had left outside the tent. Keep seeing it. Devil Dog exploding, Warhorse burning. Wondering why we made it and they didn't. What cosmic dice roll determined survival? Patterson took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat burn his tongue, welcoming the sensation as proof of life. But asking myself the same thing. 6 feet to the left and that round hits us instead of missing. 1 second slower reversing from that last position, and we're the ones burning. There's no logic to it, no fairness. They sat in silence for a while, watching the distant glow of artillery fire on the horizon, where other men were dying in battles that would never be studied or remembered. The war continued, vast and indifferent to their survival or their trauma. Tomorrow, they would climb back into their tanks and do it again, and the day after, and the day after that, until the war ended, or they joined the men in the graves. I keep thinking about something my training instructor said back at Fort Knox, Hughes said quietly, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. Sergeant Kowalski. He told us that the Sherman was a death trap, that we were signing up to be cannon fodder for German guns, that they had better tanks and we'd just have to accept higher casualties and win through numbers. Said it was mathematics, not courage. He wasn't wrong about the equipment, Patterson replied. On paper, we shouldn't have won today. No, but he was wrong about the outcome. We won today. 5 against 20 and we won. We're still here. We survived. That's not the same as winning. Hughes shook his head with surprising vehemence. No, Sarge, we won. We held the position. We stopped their advance. We destroyed 8 of their tanks, maybe crippled a couple more. We accomplished the mission. That's winning, even if it doesn't feel like it, even if it cost us too much. Maybe not the Hollywood version with parades and medals, but it counts for something. 3 days later, after mechanics had worked around the clock to repair battle damage and replace destroyed components, Patterson and his crew were back in action. Thunderbolt had been patched up, the gouged armor plates replaced with spares cannibalized from irreparable wrecks, the damaged periscope swapped out for a new one, fresh ammunition loaded into the racks, fuel tanks topped off. The maintenance crews had worked through 2 nights with minimal sleep to get the surviving tanks operational again, knowing that the division couldn't afford to lose any armor strength with the push toward Germany continuing. The psychological impact of Arracourt had already begun to spread through the division like a contagion of confidence. During the briefing for the next operation, conducted in a farmhouse requisitioned as a temporary headquarters, the division commander, Brigadier General Harold Pierce, referenced the engagement directly, something commanders rarely did with individual actions. "Gentlemen," Pierce began, his weathered face showing the strain of command but also satisfaction. "You've probably heard about what happened at Arracourt 3 days ago. 5 Shermans from Company A held off 20 Panthers and emerged victorious. I want that to sink in for a moment. Let it challenge your assumptions. The enemy's armor isn't invincible. It's just metal operated by men who can make mistakes. Superior tactics, aggressive maneuvering, and raw courage can overcome superior equipment. We're not going to let the Germans intimidate us with their Tigers and Panthers anymore. We're going to fight smart, fight together, and win." The change in morale was palpable, visible in the way men sat straighter, looked each other in the eye, spoke with less resignation and more determination. Tank crews who had approached every engagement with fatalistic acceptance now showed cautious optimism, discussing tactics rather than just accepting orders. Intelligence officers began studying the engagement in exhaustive detail, preparing tactical bulletins that would be mimeographed and distributed throughout the European theater. The after-action report from Arracourt would eventually make its way up the chain of command to Shave headquarters, where it would be read by Eisenhower himself, who used it as evidence that American armored doctrine, emphasizing reliability, numerical superiority, and combined arms tactics, was fundamentally sound despite the Sherman's technical inferiority to German heavy tanks. Patterson's crew developed a reputation that followed them like a shadow. Other tank commanders sought them out during meals or maintenance periods, asking detailed questions about targeting priorities, positioning techniques, how to identify weak spots on German armor through binoculars or periscopes. Foster found himself explaining a dozen times, with increasing patience, how he'd learned to aim for the Panther's turret ring, a thin seam where the turret met the hull that could jam the traverse mechanism if hit precisely, immobilizing the gun even if it didn't penetrate. Hughes demonstrated to gathered groups how to use terrain features to mask movement, how to reverse at full speed without losing orientation, how to read the ground for soft spots that might bog down heavier tanks. The knowledge spread like ripples in a pond, each crew passing lessons to others. Crews who had never faced Panthers learned from those who had survived the encounter. Techniques were refined through discussion and debate. Tactics evolved through collective experience. The American approach to armored warfare, Patterson realized, wasn't about building the best individual tank. It was about building a system where training, logistics, maintenance, and combined arms support created an advantage that superior German engineering couldn't overcome alone. But survival came with a cost that had nothing to do with armor penetration or ammunition expenditure. Patterson noticed it first in himself, the way he flinched at sudden noises that reminded him of incoming rounds, the nightmares that jolted him awake, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, the inability to relax, even in supposedly safe areas where enemy fire couldn't reach. The technical term was combat fatigue, though the crews just called it getting tanker twitchy, a dark joke that acknowledged reality without dwelling on it. Foster developed a tremor in his hands that made fine movements difficult, especially in the morning before his first cigarette. The steady hands that had made him an excellent gunner now shook when he tried to write letters home or eat soup. Hughes stopped joking entirely, his usual easygoing nature replaced by grim silence, punctuated only by necessary communication. Walsh, the loader, began obsessively checking and rechecking the ammunition storage, convinced that a single misplaced shell would cause a catastrophic explosion like the one that had killed Devil Dog's crew, spending his free time rearranging rounds that were already properly stowed. The military had no real solution for this beyond rotation. Crews were supposed to be pulled from frontline duty after sustained combat operations, given time to rest and recover before returning to action. But the war's demands were relentless, and experienced tank crews were too valuable to spare when replacements were still learning which end of the gun fired. They kept fighting because there was no alternative, kept climbing into their Sherman, knowing that each mission might be their last, kept trusting their training even as their nerves frayed like old rope under constant tension. In late October, during a 3-day lull in operations, when both sides paused to regroup and resupply, the division received a visit from a delegation of war correspondents and military observers from the States. They wanted to interview the heroes of Arracourt to document for the folks back home how American courage and ingenuity had overcome German steel and precision engineering. Patterson and Harlow were ordered to participate, both men finding the attention uncomfortable and vaguely obscene given what the attention represented. The lead correspondent, a newspaper reporter from Chicago named Arthur Winston, who wore a clean uniform and spoke in polished sentences, peppered them with questions clearly designed to produce quotable heroics for the morning papers. How did it feel to face down 20 enemy tanks? Were you afraid? What went through your mind when you fired the killing shot? Did you think about your families back home? What would you say to young men considering joining the Tank Corps? Patterson tried to answer honestly, choosing his words carefully. We were terrified every single second. Every instinct screamed to run, to get out of that tank and find a hole to hide in. But we had a job to do, and running wasn't an option. Would have meant death for the infantry behind us. We did what we were trained to do, what thousands of other tank crews do every day across Europe and the Pacific. There's nothing special about us. We just happened to survive long enough for the story to get told. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it. Winston seemed disappointed by this answer, his pencil hesitating over his notepad, clearly hoping for something more dramatic, more patriotic, more suitable for headlines. He tried again, angling for better material. But surely you must have felt some sense of triumph, knowing you'd beaten impossible odds, proven American superiority? Harlow cut in, his voice hard with barely controlled anger. Triumph. 2 of our tanks were completely destroyed. 10 men died horrible deaths, burned alive or blown apart. Another dozen were wounded. Yeah, we stopped the German advance, and that matters strategically, but the cost was higher than any newspaper headline is going to mention or any reader is going to remember. You want a story about triumph? Write about the crews of Warhorse and Devil Dog. They're the real heroes, not us. We just lived. The interview ended awkwardly, Winston packing up his notepad with obvious dissatisfaction, and Patterson doubted anything they'd actually said would make it into print. The war correspondents wanted clean narratives about good versus evil, American ingenuity and determination overcoming Axis aggression and tyranny. They didn't want complexity or ambiguity, didn't want to hear about the luck involved, the mistakes made, the fine line between survival and death. They certainly didn't want to hear about men who died because they zigged when they should have zagged, because chance determined outcomes as much as skill. But the military's intelligence apparatus had a very different agenda. The Army's Operational Research Group sent a team of analysts to interview every surviving crew member to compile a detailed tactical study of the engagement that would inform training and doctrine. These weren't journalists looking for inspirational quotes. They were scientists and mathematicians trying to extract reproducible lessons from chaos, to find patterns in the violence that could be taught and replicated. Patterson spent an entire day with a major from the research group, walking the Arracourt battlefield, which had been carefully preserved as a study site, recreating the engagement in excruciating detail. The major had maps marked with every tank's position at 5-minute intervals throughout the battle, technical diagrams showing firing angles and armor penetration points calculated from impact evidence, weather data calculating visibility ranges in fog conditions at different times. He asked questions that seemed bizarre in their specificity, exactly how many seconds between shots, precisely what radio calls were made, what visual cues triggered which decisions. What we're trying to determine, the Major explained during a break, consulting his notes while Patterson smoked a cigarette, is whether this outcome was replicable or anomalous. Was this a perfect storm of favorable conditions that could never be recreated? Or can we teach other crews to achieve similar results in similar circumstances? That's the difference between a lucky accident and a tactical innovation. The question haunted Patterson more than he wanted to admit. He thought about all the factors that had contributed to their survival. The fog that delayed German acquisition of targets by precious minutes, the terrain that provided just enough cover at critical moments, the Panthers' decision to advance cautiously rather than aggressively, the timely arrival of reinforcements before ammunition ran completely out. Change any one variable in that equation and they'd likely have been annihilated. So how do you teach that? I don't know if you can teach someone to do what we did, Patterson finally said, choosing his words carefully, because so much of it was reacting in the moment, trusting instinct developed through experience, making split-second decisions that could have been catastrophically wrong but happened to be right. You can teach tactics and gunnery and maneuver principles in a classroom or on a training range, but you can't teach the intangible stuff, the crew coordination that develops from fighting together, the ability to stay calm when everything's falling apart, the willingness to hold position when every fiber of your being wants to run. That comes from somewhere else. The Major nodded thoughtfully, making more notes. That's valuable data in itself. It suggests that crew cohesion and combat experience are as important as technical training, perhaps more so. The longer a crew fights together and survives, the better their odds of continuing to survive. Unfortunately, that creates a catch-22 situation where the crews who need experience most are least likely to survive long enough to gain it. The conversation shifted to equipment and potential modifications. The Major wanted Patterson's opinion on whether the Sherman's design should be modified based on lessons from Arracourt, whether throwing more resources at a technical solution could improve crew survivability. Patterson considered this carefully, thinking about the trade-offs and limitations. If I could change one thing, Patterson said slowly, it would be ammunition storage location and protection. Right now, the rounds are stacked too close to where enemy shells enter the tank. One penetrating hit often sets off the whole magazine, causing catastrophic explosions like what killed Devil Dog's crew. If we could store ammo in water-jacketed compartments with blowout panels that channel explosions upward instead of into the crew space, maybe fewer tanks would explode when hit. Maybe more crews would survive to bail out. The Major made extensive notes, his pencil flying across the page. That's actually being implemented in newer production models, based on exactly this kind of field feedback. The M4A3E8 variant will have wet ammunition storage and improved armor thickness. Should start reaching frontline units by early 1945, though production is ramping up slowly. Will it be enough to face Panthers and Tigers on equal terms? Against Panthers and Tigers in a straight one-on-one fight, probably not. The armor and gun advantages are too significant. But combined with improved tactics like what you demonstrated here, better crew training, air support, artillery coordination, and numerical superiority, it shifts the overall odds in our favor. We win through systems, not individual superiority. As November arrived, the weather turned brutally cold and wet. Cold rain fell constantly for days at a time, transforming the battlefield into a quagmire of mud that bogged down both armies and made every movement an ordeal. Tank operations became nightmarish exercises in mechanical endurance as engines struggled with the cold temperatures. Tracks churned through knee-deep muck that clutched at them like hands, and crews froze despite every layer of clothing they could wear. Thunderbolt's crew adapted to the miserable conditions with the stoic resignation of men who had survived worse, who knew that discomfort was infinitely preferable to death. They wrapped themselves in every piece of spare clothing they could scavenge. Extra socks, scarves, gloves, blankets worn as shawls. They heated ration cans on the engine manifold, the only source of warmth available, eating half-cooked food that was at least hot. They learned to sleep in cramped positions that minimized contact with the tank's freezing metal interior, positions that left them stiff and aching but avoided frostbite. During this period, Patterson received letters from home for the first time in weeks, the mail having finally caught up with their rapid advance. His mother wrote about her work at a munitions factory, the long shifts and quotas, about rationing and war bond drives, and the Gold Star flags appearing in neighbors' windows, marking families who had lost sons. His younger brother, who had just turned 17 and was filled with patriotic enthusiasm, was eager to enlist the moment he was eligible, and kept asking if Patterson could put in a good word to get him assigned to an armored unit, to serve together like brothers in the movies. Patterson read that line 3 times, feeling his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. He carefully folded the letter and put it away in his jacket pocket, against his heart. That evening, by the light of a flickering candle in his tent, he wrote a response that was probably harsher than necessary, probably unfair to his brother's youthful idealism. He told his brother in blunt terms to stay in school, to wait until the war was over, to find any excuse to avoid combat. He described what it felt like to watch friends die, to live with the knowledge that survival was mostly luck, regardless of skill, to carry memories that would never fade no matter how much time passed. He described the smell of burning men and the sound of screams over the radio, and the sight of empty boots next to graves. He sealed the letter, then immediately regretted writing it with such brutal honesty. His brother deserved to make his own choices, to serve his country if that's what he wanted, to be treated as a man rather than a child to be protected. But Patterson couldn't shake the image of his little brother climbing into a Sherman, couldn't bear the thought of him experiencing what had happened at Arracourt, couldn't stomach the idea of writing their mother to explain that both her sons wouldn't be coming home. December brought the German Ardennes offensive, the massive surprise attack through the Belgian forests that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 4th Armored Division was pulled from Lorraine and sent north in forced marches to help relieve the besieged American garrison at Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered but refusing to surrender. Thunderbolt and its crew participated in the relief operation, fighting through brutal winter conditions against determined German resistance, making their last major offensive of the war. The lessons learned at Arracourt served them well in the frozen forests of Belgium. When they encountered Panthers in the snow-covered woods, Patterson's crew didn't panic or freeze. They maneuvered using trees for cover, they coordinated with supporting infantry who could spot for them, they targeted weak points with disciplined fire instead of wasting ammunition on impenetrable armor. They survived engagements that would have destroyed them months earlier, not because their tank had improved or they'd received better equipment, but because they had improved, because experience was its own form of armor. On December 26th, when the relief column finally broke through to Bastogne after days of brutal fighting, Patterson saw something that crystallized everything he'd experienced over the past 3 months of combat. A group of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, haggard and exhausted from days of siege warfare, emerged from their defensive positions to greet the arriving armor. One of them, a sergeant with a bandaged head and 1,000-yard stare, walked up to Thunderbolt and placed his hand on the hull like it was something holy. "Thought you boys weren't comin'," the paratrooper said, his voice hoarse from yelling orders and breathing cordite smoke. "Heard the Germans had you stopped cold." "Had to fight our way through half the German army," Patterson replied from the turret, looking down at the soldier who had held impossible odds. "But we don't quit. Neither do you, apparently." The paratrooper looked at the Sherman, its armor scarred by countless hits that hadn't quite penetrated, its paint scorched by near misses, its tracks worn nearly smooth from hundreds of miles, and then at the crew's faces, which bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged combat stress that he recognized in his own reflection. "You look like hell," the paratrooper observed, with the brutal honesty of soldiers. Patterson laughed, the sound surprising him after days of grim silence. It felt good to laugh, felt human. "You should see the other guys. Germans look worse than us." That night, as Thunderbolt sat in defensive position on the outskirts of Bastogne, engine idling to keep it from freezing solid, Patterson reflected on how far they'd come from that September morning at Arracourt. They'd proven that inferior equipment could overcome superior machines through skill and determination and courage. They'd survived odds that should have killed them a dozen times over, odds that had killed others just as skilled and brave. They'd lost friends and gained scars, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. But more than that, they'd learned something fundamental about warfare that no textbook or training manual could fully convey. That weapons were just tools, but people were the actual weapon system. The best tank in the world was useless with a poorly trained crew who panicked under fire. A mediocre tank with an experienced, cohesive crew who trusted each other absolutely could achieve what looked impossible on paper. The war would continue for another 4 months of grinding combat. Thunderbolt and its crew would fight their way across Germany, would participate in the Rhine crossing, would witness the death of the Nazi regime. They would survive, though not unscathed. Hughes would lose 2 fingers to frostbite that turned gangrenous. Foster would take shrapnel in the leg during an artillery barrage. Walsh would be hospitalized for severe combat fatigue. But they would survive, when so many others didn't. And decades later, when military historians studied the European campaign, trying to understand how American forces overcame German technical superiority in armored warfare, despite inferior equipment, they would return again and again to the engagement at Arracourt. 5 Shermans against 20 Panthers, a battle that shouldn't have been won according to every tactical calculation, but was won anyway through factors that couldn't be reduced to armor thickness or gun caliber. Patterson kept a photograph from that day, a grainy black and white image showing Thunderbolt after the battle, its crew sitting on the hull, exhausted but alive. Behind them, smoke rose from destroyed Panthers, testimony to what determination and training could achieve against impossible odds. The photographer had caught them in an unguarded moment, before they could compose their faces into expressions appropriate for heroes. He showed it to his grandson years later, when the boy was old enough to ask what war was really like, beyond the sanitized versions in history books. "This is the day we learn that courage matters more than armor," Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of years. That people, not machines, win wars. That sometimes the impossible is just the difficult that hasn't been attempted yet. That survival sometimes requires you to do things that seem insane until they work. The grandson studied the photo with youthful intensity, taking in the battered tank, the exhausted faces, the battlefield littered with wreckage that represented both victory and loss. "Were you scared, Grandpa?" Patterson smiled sadly, remembering the taste of fear so clearly even after decades. Every single second, from start to finish. But we did it anyway. That's what courage actually is. Being absolutely terrified and doing your duty regardless, because other people are counting on you. The Battle of Arracourt entered military doctrine, studied at West Point and armor schools around the world for generations. The tactics developed there, aggressive maneuver, targeting of vulnerable points, crew coordination under extreme stress, became standard training for armored forces. The psychological impact, the breaking of the Panthers' invincible reputation, rippled through American armored forces and contributed to the confidence that carried them to ultimate victory. But for the men who were there, who smelled the cordite and felt the heat of burning tanks and heard their friends' screams over the radio, it remained something more personal and immediate than tactical lessons. It was the day they discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. The day they learned that survival sometimes requires you to do things that seem insane until they work. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.